it holds promise, but like all things in AI, we've got a lot of new going on right now that holds promise.
We've seen some amazing stuff happening, but also some less positive stuff at the same time.
We've lost a little bit of the sight of what the data is and how we're using the data.
AI has never existed in a legal vacuum. If we have human rights law, if we have non-discrimination legislation, copyright, consumer legislation, they all apply to artificial intelligence.
You are listening to the AI with Maribel Lopez podcast, or AI with ML. If this is your first time listening, thank you for joining. The AI with Maribel Lopez podcast is brought to you by the Data for Betterment Foundation. This podcast shares the stories of the people behind the new world of data and AI. What are they creating? And why does it matter? If you like this episode, please subscribe so you can easily find the podcast again. You can find the video version of this podcast at youtube.com at AI with Maribel Lopez. You can also share your feedback and ideas with me on X, also known as Twitter, and LinkedIn. All links are in the show notes. Extended show notes, episodes, and transcripts can be found at lopezresearch.com/podcast. I hope you'll enjoy the show.
Hello and welcome to the AI program with Maribel Lopez. Today I'm speaking with Ivana Bartoletti. She is the Global Privacy Chief Officer at Wipro. Wipro, which is an international information technology consulting and business process services company. I'm sure many people are familiar with them. They've been around for a while. Ivana is a passionate leader in the privacy space and stresses that public trust is essential to harness AI's benefits. And while Ivana is an enthusiastic proponent of AI, she also has strong points of view on how we should think about privacy and regulation. Ivana, welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
I'm very excited to have you. I know we are doing a multiple time zone stretch here from Europe to the East Coast of the United States. But I thought we could get started with a podcast by discussing the broader Wipro point of view on AI and policy. I mean, Wipro has been at the forefront of leveraging AI for policymaking. Maybe you could discuss how things like AI-powered policy as a service can help multinational corporations, or just any characteristics you'd like to share with the audience to get us started with how you're thinking about AI.
Yeah, no, so it's great. So AI is really everywhere now. Now it's transforming the way we live, the way we work, the way that we interact. And it's been around for a very long time. The big change has happened with generative AI and so the ability and the capacity that these systems have to generate text or images, and with all the good, the fantastic things that they can do, they can help us, but also some of the sort of the less good stuff. For example, the deep fakes being used for things like, for example, deep fake pornography. So we've seen some amazing stuff happening, but also some less positive stuff at the same time. Now, the reason why it's crucial and in relation to privacy, and I'm very much involved in privacy and also security, but also the AI governance more in general, is that of course when it comes to generative AI, it does challenge a lot of the privacy concepts that we've had in mind. So if you think about these tools, they are being created by scraping a lot of data from the web. So that is, and a lot of this data is personal data. They also generate personal information about us, which may be accurate, may not be accurate, because sometimes this system, as we say, hallucinate. Although hallucination is not really a good word, because to me it's a little bit too human to be good. And the machines are machines; they're not. But now we also have this new stuff, which is called agentic AI. Which is basically AI that is used to do a lot of stuff on our behalf. And that means, for example, having a personal office at your disposal 24/7. If you want to travel, they can buy tickets for you, interact with the rest of the world. And of course, that also poses problems from a privacy and AI governance standpoint. So the key thing is how you make sure that you enjoy all the benefits of all these things, and at the same time you respect human dignity and privacy, because privacy is a very important collective good. It means that you have your dignity and your agency in the world, right? So how you do this at the same time, and some very influential scholars like, for example, Daniel Solav in the US, they have been sort of very advocating very strongly on the role of privacy in the age of AI as a legislation that may need updating, may need rethinking, but still is legislation that can really help safeguarding the rights of individuals in this digital age.
I think we've been so focused on, does the technology work? How do we scale the technology? How do we integrate it into the businesses, that we've lost a little bit of the sight of what the data is and how we're using the data and the implications for the individuals that are using it, the consumers that are using it that aren't necessarily hip to, say, regulations and privacy, but also the businesses that want to try to have more targeted approaches to engaging with their customers. And you mentioned something really interesting about agentic AI. I think, we're kind of going down the path of generative AI. We're talking about hallucinations, and now we're starting this concept of automation and agents talking to agents, which I think actually escalates the problem that you're speaking
For
about.
sure.
It's sort of becoming an by problem now. So I know that Wipro, there's this concept of the four dimensions of responsible AI, because you were talking about AI and governance. Can you share a little bit about what that means and how it might contribute to a stronger AI governance for corporations?
Yeah, absolutely. So interesting. So the four dimensions of responsible AI came up when we started to brainstorm about how are we going to scale up AI use and development, because we have, for example, Lab 45, which is our more sort of research and development hub, where we create a lot of things and that then we can use in-house or for our customers. So we were thinking about, okay, we really want to invest in this, right? We really want to scale up. We had 2 billion investment in AI, but how are we actually doing it in a way that safeguards us, right? And not us as a business, but as I'm talking about individuals, society, the environment. So we said, okay, we will, of course, we will be compliant with legislation, because AI does not exist in isolation, right? I mean, you see all the cases around copyright, you see the cases around non-discrimination legislation. AI doesn't exist in a legal vacuum. So obviously you want to be compliant. But the four dimensions of responsible AI, they talk about ethics, which is more than compliance, right? So ethics starts where, to me, ethics starts where the law ends. So you say, this is me as a company. This is where I'm going to position myself. And he said there are four things that really matter to us when it comes to AI. So AI, artificial intelligence, has to respect the individual sphere. That means basically privacy, right? So that basically means that we need to retain human agency. That means human in control. It means that you decide. It means that, yes, you can have a recommendation made by AI, but ultimately we want the sort of humans to retain decision making and to be responsible so they can work with the machines. But the artificial intelligence and human intelligence are two separate things. Then we are looking at, for example, the social side of it, the social dimension, which for us was very important. So, for example, we were looking at bias, and we were saying we do not want algorithms that, of course, algorithms ingest real-time data. Real-time data is not neutral, right? It represents society as it is, with its sort of social inequalities. And once this data is used in an unfettered way and is just ingested into the systems that make decisions about us, they may crystallize and softwareize the existing inequalities into the systems. And we don't want that. We actually want to have an aspirational way of doing AI. And then we were looking at the environmental element, because AI can be great in reducing, for example, looking at managing the power grid or thinking of how AI, our energy can be misused. But at the same time, it does consume energy. So what are we going to do in terms of ensuring that we're able to reduce the environmental footprint of AI? And the fourth element is the technical one. We want AI which is robust, which is compliant, which is safe. So we built our governance around these four dimensions. And this means that these 4 dimensions, they're embedded in the way that we also create AI. It means that we work on privacy, security, robustness, and legal protection in the design. And it's a big challenge. It's an important challenge for us because we want to equip everybody who works on AI development, not just deployment, to really think about all these things. So they're not an afterthought, but they're actually embedded into our products.
And I love the way you talk about the embedded nature, because I think one of the things that we're struggling with as organizations is we really want to use open foundation models, and open foundation models have been trained on everything. Some of it's accurate, some of it's inaccurate, much of it is biased. And if you start there, it's kind of hard to unwind that and add it in after the fact. So companies like yours that are building AI algorithms, if you start with the concept of trying to make sure that you're detecting and mitigating biases, it puts us in a better place to start. There's less to unwind. So I think we're starting to get more thoughtful as industries in terms of how things happen. And you mentioned that you're also looking at security. I think that's another very interesting angle that most people haven't quite put together yet, but there's a dimension of ethics, privacy, and security, and actual security of the models themselves, to make sure that they don't have data poisoning and can do things
Exactly.
that you didn't expect them to do, right? Um, when you think of things like detecting and mitigating bias, you're talking about building that into the products. Are you starting to see people looking at things like synthetic data? Or are you starting to look at synthetic
Yeah.
data to try to kind of create the world that you want the model to represent?
Yeah, I mean, that's very aspirational, and you would hope that that this aspiration is there, in the sense that, for example, I remember an interesting conversation between Sam Altman and Joy Buolamwini, and where he was talking about this. He was looking at, because obviously this generative AI models, they do or run the risk of representing the same bias that were in society. And he was very and of course these companies, they've been doing a lot of work in mitigating all of this, and he was very clear, on the fact that he would hope, he was saying, yes, we also need to be aspirational, right, in the sense of imagining the kind of society that we want. And I think this is an important element, especially that sort of to bear in mind. I think synthetic data is an interesting one because it could go both ways. So on the I am always like, I love talking about synthetic data because on the one hand I feel, yes, we can really have synthetic data to fill in the gaps. Of course, you need people who realize that there are gaps in the first place, right? And they people who make the choice of saying we want a more fair output, and the fairness of the output is not a neutral choice. So somebody's going to make their choice. And then you can say, okay, I'm going to play with the data. I'm going to have synthetic data. And synthetic data is useful from a privacy standpoint, from a bias mitigation, but it also has downsides, no? First of all, it does legitimate the idea that all data needs collection to an extent. It does legitimate the idea of that data-driven means that we have to have a lot of data. Is it true? Is it still true that we need to have a lot of data? I mean, I think we have seen in recent times a lot of improvements in this space. And also, I mean, it's still not 100% safe when it comes to security, synthetic data. Overall, I'm a big fan in the sense that I do think that I think that is good for privacy, even if there are still areas that need to be explored. I think that is overall is good if we can collect less, perhaps go to a point where we collect less data, although this seems a little bit hard to imagine. But so overall, I am positive, but I don't think is kind of the sort of the ultimate solution. And I think a lot of people are still evaluating and studying synthetic data.
I absolutely agree. I think it's still a very new field. It holds promise, but like all things in AI, we've got a lot of new
Yeah,
going on right
yeah,
now that holds
exactly.
promise. What it is interesting. You brought up the concept of how much data is enough, and I think this is one of the things that's very different from when I started the podcast a couple years ago, because
Yeah.
when I started the podcast a couple years ago, everything was about big data, lots and lots of data. You needed so much data to build the model, to understand what's going on. And I think between the cost and the energy utilization and the desire for more specificity and accuracy, we're starting to come to a different point on that, where there's large models and smaller models and varying amounts of data that are required. And really, perhaps a focus that we should have had all along on the right data as opposed to the volume of data.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the right data has always been a challenge. I think I could go back many, many years in my career. We're not going to talk about how many years in my career, but a lot of years, let's say. And we've always had this discussion of, do we have the right data? Is the data clean? And I think that AI just really shines a light on that problem for every organization. And I know that you've probably spent a long time on this, but I wanted to talk a little bit about something that you launched called Audrey. It's a global coalition to promote human rights in the digital world. And I was wondering if you could share some of your insights or the key initiatives and goals of Audrey.
Yeah. So it to an extent is stems from the same things that we've been talking, right, about just now. So to an extent, you were correctly mentioned. It's very fascinating. You were saying 2 years ago it was all about data. To an extent, if you think about it, data, and including personal data, is a great source of power. And um, being a great source of power is also this power is also not really well balanced, in the sense that if you think about the relationship, and here I'm talking about as an individual, if I look at the relationship between us and, for example, companies having a lot of data about us, you can see this asymmetry of power, right? There are, and there's also this asymmetry of power in relation to the fact that we give data and people give data at any point of their lives, whether it's paying with a card or whether it's going and use the underground. But there is still too much opacity in the way that this data is used. And so this asymmetry of power is exactly the starting point for Audrey, in the sense that it started with say, how can we address that asymmetry of power between people, also communities, and sort of the digital ecosystem and who operates within it. And it started with that. It started with two organizations getting together, which is Women Leading in AI and Equality Now. Women Leading in AI, which I run, which is very much based on women leading in AI in policy, governance, coding, and Equality Now is an organization that is very much focused on sort of advancing the rights of women through legal protection. So these sort of two groups getting together and saying, okay, how do we make sure that we can somehow reduce this asymmetry? And of course, there are many different ways to reduce it. For example, you can say companies have an obligation to be transparent and to say to people exactly what they're doing. Respecting privacy. Privacy to me is very much related to equity, because every time I heard the word privacy, I always ask myself, privacy for whom? It's like, so there is a very, and once again, very much related to the issue of power and balance of power, right? Again, when we talk about privacy. So it's all about that. It's all about power. And this is the problem with what we wanted to address. And one of the first things that we've done is working on the United Nations digital compact, which is basically a document that is been approved by the UN, which looks at what it means, to have digital human rights in the digital age. But we've also been very much involved in the European AI Act, various legislation across the world. But it's not just about legislation. I mean, ultimately, I'm not. That's not what we're interested in purely interested in. It's very much about how we grow with artificial intelligence and in a responsible way, and how do we make sure that we can trust these products, and what it means to build that trust, and so this is sort of where we've And we do a lot of awareness and a lot of campaigning and advocacy to ensure that we look at what it means, to inhabit this digital space and build equity in the digital space too, so that also the dividends are distributed fairly across all players.
In some ways, I think we've covered this, but just to place a bit of a finer point on it, you talk to many organizations and you're also in many government discussions as well. What do you think is a common mistake that you're seeing happening in the field right now that you'd love to see corrected?
Yeah. So no, this is a wonderful question. Thank you. I mean, first of all, I would like to see corrected the idea that we have to come up with this pressure to say, okay, do we need AI regulation or we don't need it? This dichotomy between innovation regulation. And I would want people to stop for a moment and say, hey, hold on a second. AI has never existed in a legal vacuum, right? If we have human rights law, if we have non-discrimination legislation, copyright, consumer legislation, if we have privacy, they all apply to artificial intelligence. And in a matter of fact, if you look at states like Colorado or New York State or Texas and the discussions around it, or privacy legislation does play an important role when it comes to protecting and safeguarding the rights of individuals and individual dignity and autonomy in the age of AI. So to me, I would very much like to say, hey, hold on a second, we don't live in a vacuum. And we do need to think about how we can use existing legislation and how this legislation applies to artificial intelligence. And of course, and whether we need to change it. I mean, is that good enough? Does it need an update before we jump into things that may be in the longer term not adequate, too rushed in? So to me, this is really important. And the other thing is kind of vocabulary, because I feel sometimes in the space of AI in governments, business, that people speak different languages, in the sense that, we speak different language. I mean, and this is important within businesses, like the lawyers and developers, we understand each other, but it's also important across government and private sector, so that we can all collaborate and make sure that we have the best ecosystem in place to grow with AI responsibly. So I think this is really important. This sort of awareness that we have we're able to speak a common language across all of us, I think is crucial.
I love that concept of trying to get to that common language. And perhaps to close out the podcast, maybe you could share something that you're really excited about in the space moving forward, or some progress that you see happen that you'd like to share with.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very excited because I am seeing that regardless of spaces of the world, countries or regulation or whatever, I'm really excited by the fact that I was in Paris at the AI Summit, and it was really interesting because the focus is on adoption, right? Like, how do we adopt AI? But there was a proliferation of events and agreements and things happening in relation, for example, to privacy in AI and environmental protection, and how we can make sure that we reduce the footprint. So what I'm excited about is that there may be a lot of debates around regulation, non-regulation, innovation versus regulation, but there is a lot of work happening in industry, in governments across the world, to try and align to an extent, even in the complexity of the world we live in, on the fact that we can build fair AI. We can build AI that has less of a negative environmental footprint. We can use open source, right? And we can find alternative ways. So I think there is that happening, which I've seen a lot of it in Paris, which I thought was really interesting, and that excites me. The idea that there is also positive progress coming is exciting. It's really good.
I love that. I think it's such a great shift that we're seeing in the world, that we're being very conscious of it. And Ivana, I'm so happy to know that there are people like you in the world that are helping us get there.
Thank you so much.
And that's it. Thank you for listening, folks.
Thank you for listening. Additional content can be found at lopezresearch.com/podcasts. Until next time, wishing you all the best.